All right, so with rumors of conference realignment and conference expansion kind of coming back into fruition with Florida State getting left out of the playoff, sounds like they're trying to leave the ACC. So today we're going to be taking a look at 10 candidates that the Big Ten could be interested in, plus 5 honorable mentions. Also, I do have a video on the SEC, the ACC, the Big 12, and the American. If you're interested in that, check that out after this video. But let's go ahead and dive into the Big Ten. So first up, like I said, 5 honorable mentions. Let's go ahead and show all these right here. I was 5 honorable mentions, starting at number 5, Oklahoma State. I haven't seen any really connections with them and the Big Ten, but Oklahoma State, a pretty solid football program, one of the most consistent of the last 20 years. You got Mike Gundy there, pretty good head coach, and Oklahoma State, pretty good football market. If you want to get into the southern recruiting, as far as Oklahoma and Texas is concerned, you can do worse than Oklahoma State. Number 4, Pitt. Okay, so Pitt kind of fits the bill of a Big Ten school. You're adding in another Pennsylvania school if this happens. And while Pitt is not the most successful football program, they are a name, they are a brand name, can bring in some revenue, can bring in some money, bringing them in from the ACC. Number 3, Kansas. Really a name I'm surprised has not been thrown around a lot. I guess they don't make as much money in football as you would think, because most of the times with these, the goal that you'll see with some of these schools when we get to the top is like, you want to get your foot in the door and just be the powerhouse school of this said state that is not occupied at the moment by a Power 2 school. So if they're not in the Big Ten or the SEC, say we're trying to get into Kansas, establish our footing there so we can set up a pipeline or recruiting cycle for that state and just kind of pull in every good recruit from that state. So, for example, Kansas, whether it's, North Dakota, South Dakota, somewhere on the East Coast, wherever, that's kind of a common theme you'll see. All right, number 2, Missouri. I know they're in the SEC at the moment, but whenever they joined the SEC, when they were leaving the Big 12, they actually preferred to be in the Big 10, but the Big 10 wasn't interested in them at the moment. Would they be interested now that they're trying to expand even more? To be determined. Because the rumors are right now that possibly, maybe not, that the inevitable goal here is for both Power 2 conferences to get to 20 or 24 teams. So Missouri would be an interesting prospect. They had a really good football year this year. And if you can pull in a school from the SEC somehow, I don't think you can. But if you could do that, that wouldn't be a bad get. All right, number 1 here. The only reason Clemson is not on that actual list is because the top 10 teams on this list, I actually have from a pretty good source that the Big Ten not necessarily has contacted, but has had discussions about bringing in those schools for interviews of sorts, you know what I mean? And Clemson is not on that list. But with that being said, if Clemson is interested in you in joining your conference, you don't say no. The feeling I got from that source was that the reason Clemson was not on that list is because there's a feeling that they're going to end up in the SEC inevitably. So why waste our time when we can focus on other schools? But if somehow you can get a package of Clemson and Florida State, why not take it? You know what I mean? So let's go ahead and get into the actual list here. And like I said, Clemson's going to be better than some of these teams on here as far as revenue-wise and just program-wise. But they're not on this list because they weren't on the 10 I saw. All right, so number 10, Georgia Tech. All right, so for example, like I would take Clemson over Georgia Tech. You know what I mean? But Georgia Tech has been discussed by higher-ups in the Big Ten about joining the Big Ten previously. Mainly, these discussions took place in that last batch of realignment whenever they brought in, Washington, Oregon, USC, UCLA. All these 10 teams were thrown around as well in discussions. So Georgia Tech, been in the SEC a long time ago, left the SEC. You be getting your foot in Georgia. So maybe you can compete with Georgia a little bit as far as pulling in recruits. You'd have a hot spot in Atlanta, being at Georgia Tech. So definitely an interesting get, but I don't think Georgia Tech's a realistic option. Number 9, Utah. Okay, another school that has been discussed by the Big Ten. They're leaving the Pac-12 now, headed to the Big 12 next year. This is similar to like we were saying with Kansas. So get your foot in the door as far as we're going to control this state, which means nobody from this state is leaving high school wise. Like anybody from Utah, if they're in the Big Ten, they're going to Utah if we want them. You know what I mean? So if we want a 5-star recruit from Utah, he's for sure going to the Big Ten. He's not going anywhere else. So that would kind of be your idea there. and Utah can make you some revenue. They've been pretty good in football, so here in basketball every now and then, but have made a few Rose Bowls, over the last few years. So you could definitely do worse than Utah. Number 8, Duke. Okay, so another school that was thrown around in discussions. Duke doesn't really do much for you football wise, but sometimes whenever you're bringing in one of these schools, you say bring in whichever buddy you want, bring in whichever other team in your conference you want, whichever buddy you want to come with you if that helps us get you. So, for example, if North Carolina, which spoiler alert is on this list later, if we want North Carolina and we're the Big Ten, we're like, okay, bring in somebody you want with you. Maybe you bring in Duke and you create that basketball rivalry and you just kind of control the Carolina areas, Virginia with those schools. You bring in Duke with North Carolina. That's kind of the thinking there. All right, number 7, Virginia. All right, so Virginia has been higher on my list on other conferences. So, for example, the SEC, Virginia was way up there. Similar thinking as with Utah, as with Kansas. Virginia is kind of a sleeper candidate for conference expansion, I would say. It's not one you think about because they're not the greatest at football, but you get a school that is a name brand school. All right, so they have the state in their name. Virginia, they're that state school that you would want to get if you were trying to pull a Virginia school in, them over Virginia Tech even. Virginia, while it's not the biggest revenue school, does make a lot of money, actually. And like I said, is probably the sleeper candidate that you don't think about when you're talking about conference expansion because conferences are eager to get teams in those states, like I said, so they would pull in Virginia and control Virginia. All right, number 6, Cal. All right, so some of these teams you'll see that have been in discussions as well are from the West Coast. Okay, so Cal, the team that is next, I believe, on this list as well, is a team that's similar to Cal, but you bring in basically some of the other schools from the original Pac-12 or previous Pac-12 with all the schools you've got already. So like I said earlier, you're already bringing in UCLA, USC, Washington, and Oregon. So bring in Cal with another school we'll get to here in a little bit and kind of just completely control California. You already got USC, you already got UCLA. Why not bring in Cal as well? And they can offer you some stuff academically, which sometimes with the Big Ten is of interest as well, because they have some schools like that that are, mainly academic based, which would make Cal make sense. All right, so similar with Cal, you got Stanford. All right, so this is another school that sometimes Big Ten is looking for AAU schools, what they call them. All right, as far as really high academic levels, Stanford and Cal can bring that to you. They're both not the best at football, but Stanford has had a pedigree over, a span at times, has been really good at football, borderline champion level competitors. So Stanford can get back to that level, I think. It's a little tough for them right now with NIL because you got to have certain academic basis before you can just bring anybody in. So it's a little difficult for Stanford, but you could definitely do worse than Stanford. All right, number 4, Miami. Okay, so this is one that I would have lower, but Miami is kind of a safeguard, if you will. So the reason Miami is high on this list is in case the Big Ten was to lose out on Florida State. If you lose out on Florida State and they go to the SEC, the goal here would be let's get our foot in the door in Florida. Otherwise, the SEC is just completely going to control Florida if Miami's not in a Power 2 conference. So if the SEC has Florida and Florida State and Miami's left in the ACC or Big 12, whatever, then the Big Ten wouldn't have a shot at recruiting anybody in Florida. So you get Miami in your conference if Florida State goes to the SEC. That way you can at least have some footing in Florida and have a fighter's chance to bring in some of those Florida recruits. If not, you would almost maybe see them reach for UCF. I don't think that would happen, but if they missed out on, say, Miami, Florida State, you could see them reaching for UCF just to bring in a so-called power school that could bring in some of those Florida recruits. All right, sorry about that. But Miami has been good at times. Right now they're not, but back in the beginning of like the 2000s, they were juggernauts. They were contenders every year. So they can get back to that level, but getting them to the Big Ten will be a good start. Number 3, Florida State. Okay, so if you bring in Florida State, I don't think you bring in Miami, but it is a possibility. Florida State, as of right now, is the team looking for somebody to take them. I've been told that the SEC is not interested in Florida State. It's one of those where Florida State's interested in the SEC, but the SEC's not interested back. So if that did happen, you would almost see a SMU scenario where they're like, all right, we're just going to join you just to join you. I'm talking about SMU joining the ACC. We're going to join you, and we'll go from there. We'll earn your respect as we go, But I think ultimately Florida State, I think, ends up in the Big Ten. But you never know. They could go independent, could stay in the ACC, could go to the SEC, could somehow wind up in the Big 12. I don't think that'll happen. But Florida State, I think, will end up in the Big Ten. But definitely would be a good get. They seem to be back per se, so they are going to be competitors right now, are going to bring you in a ton of money, one of the more well-known schools in football, and would bring you in a ton of revenue as well, and would give you that Florida blueprint so you can start recruiting a little bit in that Southeast. All right, number 2, North Carolina. Okay, so probably similar to Virginia, going to be the sleeper candidate for the most coveted school. North Carolina brings you in a ton of revenue. All right, they've got Jordan, and they are the state as far as the same as Virginia. You bring in this school, they control that state. You get a blueprint in there. You get your foot in the door, establish that pipeline in North Carolina for the Big Ten. That way nobody is escaping that area. And you have a ton of revenue. Like I said, North Carolina is going to bring in you a ton of money, football and basketball. And you get that recruiting cycle in there. You got that recruiting edge in North Carolina, and really can kind of essentially trap the schools. If you got Florida State and North Carolina coming, then you can kind of creep into those other states that's SEC territory and maybe steal a few recruits. All right, number 1, Notre Dame. All right, so Notre Dame, I don't think they're leaving at the moment. I don't think they're going to leave the independents. They've seen pretty hell-bent on being independent at the moment. But if Notre Dame ever decides they want to leave, they want to join a conference, they're going to be the number 1 school everybody's trying to get. They are the moneymaker. They're consistently good in football. No matter what coach they get, they're almost like LSU. Not that level as far as being competitors as far as national champions, but they're going to be a playoff contender no matter what the head coach is. And so Notre Dame is the school you would pull. They're already close enough to the area, being in Indiana. So if somehow Notre Dame said they were interested in the Big Ten would empty the banks, back the trucks up for Notre Dame to get them to join the Big Ten. But what do you think of these candidates to join the Big Ten? Who would you add to this list? Who would you move up or down? Who would you take off this list? Let me know. Comment down below. Make sure to like this video and subscribe.